Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live session. I'm Rhonda Meyer. I'm Director of Brand Marketing at Ocrolus, and I'm thrilled to bring you this insightful session on flipping the funnel, cash flow first approach to SMB underwriting. The session is being recorded. We'll send you the recording via email within the next 24 hours so that you can revisit any of the key insights that are shared with us here today. Joining us are two incredible experts who will introduce themselves to you in just a moment here. And their discussion is going to explore the benefits of cash flow first underwriting, the transformation of traditional lending funnels, and also share some real world examples, which is always helpful. So we encourage your participation here. Feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box or the chat at any time. We'll address as many as we can during the Q&A portion toward the end of our session here. So we'll also have a poll question coming up shortly. Be sure to weigh in on that when prompted as well. Definitely gives us a little bit of help to understand who's in the audience so that our guests can tailor their conversations as needed. So without further ado, I'll kick it over to our stars of the show here.
All right. Thanks, Rana. Okay, I guess I'll just quickly introduce myself first. I'm Anneika Patterson. I'm Director of SMB Product Management at Ocrolus. Most of you just know me as Nike. And if you heard Herk and me chatting at the beginning of the show, it turns out we have a shared background in musical theater. So we will be flipping the funnel into a musical version, and then we'll be putting it on ice after the show as well.
I don't think we'll sell any tickets for that. Herk Christie, Chief Operating Officer here at Expansion Capital, and I guess the Nike sidekick for the next half hour. So looking forward to this.
Very kind of you. All right, we'll get rolling here. Move on from our faces. Okay, so just kind of quick poll, show of hands here. I think we have a poll enabled in the Zoom. Okay, yes, we do. Which one of these describes you? Are you a bank, a non-bank lender, a credit union, a merchant cash advance company? Love for you to just give us a quick sense of who you are. All right. Okay, interesting. So not very surprising, but most of you are non-bank lenders and MCAs, which kind of tracks. That's a lot of whom Ocrolus serves and works with. So close to 50-50 split there with like a sprinkling of banks in there. So anyway, glad to see you and everybody's welcome here. Okay, so I'm going to just quickly tee this up, and then I'm really excited to get Herk's insights on the topic at hand. But at Ocrolus, we are really big believers in and proponents of cash flow based underwriting, specifically for SMB lending and funding. We believe that there's just a treasure trove of data and insights that lie within the bank statement. And we believe that in many cases, cash flow gives you more data as an underwriter than credit in some cases, particularly when it comes to really sussing out the debt capacity and position count of a merchant, giving you a granular view of revenue expenses, being able to use non-sufficient funds, fees, and overdrafts and recurring transactions, all as both data points for top of funnel kickouts as well as for deep detailed underwriting. So that's kind of the high level of what we'll be talking about. But Herk, I'd love to turn it over to you about like why you also are a big proponent of cash flow based underwriting and bringing cash flow higher up in the funnel.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, Nike. I think for me, background originally for me came a little bit coming out of more traditional banking, and so a lot of it was a traditional banking lens to kind of discipline to underwriting and the credit risk, and then that morphed into, where does traditional banking not do as well, maybe in coverage, kind of with that previous background and knowledge. And so part of it is looking at especially the small businesses that are really served with this marketplace. They tend to be much smaller than what the average bank deals with. And so a lot of it is, it's far more representative of how their business is structured, how they do business within really their bank accounts, rather than looking at debt leverage and kind of balance sheet type positioning. It's okay. I mean, they're dealing with day-to-day cash flow. And so for a long time, we had it at the end of our underwriting process and did more traditional, pull background credit and some other things first before we kind of got to the business metric side. And that had a lot to do with just the stability of kind of obtaining that information. And so we had always desired to move the cash flow underwriting to kind of top of the funnel. And so kind of with that transition, we were able to much better see what the true nature of the business was, right? And so for us, I think when you look at inside the bank accounts, I mean, you've got the stuff that are kind of the bulk of critical things that we analyze. Are there other positions? Specifically, what's their revenue look like? True revenue. There's other deposits sometimes that don't fit true revenue. What's their expenses? What type of expenses? And for us, it really feeds into both fraud and credit risk models. And we can get that at the very top. And so then I'm sure we'll get into later into the podcast here into more of the what some of the other stuff look like and why. But moving ahead of credit in particular as an example became very important because I think while credit's important, a lot of people look at it. I don't think for a small business, it represents the true health of the business. Definitely a component. Definitely we pull it before we fund. But early in the process, our first step is really look inside the business, and doing that is by the cash flow analytics.
Yeah, thank you, Herk. And maybe even kind of just to quote you in a conversation we had the other day, I think you've said something along the lines of, traditional underwriting methods applied to these sort of less traditional businesses will yield more, traditional results, or won't yield maybe the most accurate results when you're trying to assess the financial health of these types of businesses.
Yep. And I think it's a good point because a lot of these businesses have a bank partner that they're engaged with in some level and capacity. And if you apply similar bank underwriting, you're going to get a similar outcome in a lot of cases, right? So part of this is definitely approaching it different than a traditional bank would. And then, making sure that we don't have to spend the time to pull all of the background documentation that's necessary to kind of do a normal bank underwrite. And for us, it's getting into this looking at the cash flow, and to be honest, the smaller businesses, that is how they live their day-to-day lives, right? I mean, they're definitely working on growing it out of the cash flow capacity that they've got, and a lot of times can't board more traditional debt in their growth cycle.
Sure. Yeah. And actually, we'll flip to the next slide, but I want to zero in on something you said. Actually, maybe one more slide from this one, Rana. Thank you. You said something really interesting, which was, there is a time and a place for credit, but how do you respond to folks who say, well, I feel like personal credit, it does seem to really be working for me. It's predictive. I use it for knockouts. How do you respond to that?
With a hypocritical response. And what I mean by that is we did that before too. So I won't throw shade on it entirely from the perspective as I think it has its place and it can do things. I think the thing that always gets to be the question is when you're using your credit model to knock things out and make decisions, and specifically in the knockout category, you're basically saying I can identify how successful the business is solely off of that credit background. And in some cases, there's some truth to that, right? I think the universal rule of someone who's paying their personal obligations and has a good credit is likely to do the same for their business. And there's some truth to that. I mean, we took that philosophy before. On the flip side, this is also true, though. Some businesses, especially small entrepreneurs and startup, have to leverage personal credit to kind of become successful. That does damage the personal credit in many cases, whether it's over obligated or struggling just to make your payments, and they're putting it into the business. And so at times you'll have a really healthy business. The entrepreneur that's doing it is somewhat sacrificing personal finances to get their business off the ground. And so that's really the difference you really start to see is not always does that tell the entire story. And so then your question really becomes, how much have you knocked out of your funnel using just credit that you could have otherwise carried further through the process and made a better decision about, do I want to provide capital to this institution or not? And so I think that's the biggest difference, Nike is, and it's tough because it's the unknown. You're doing swap ins, right? You're basically looking at that saying, there's a bunch of stuff I don't know. I do know my credit. Most of us knew our credit. We were very confident in our credit model. We weren't confident in what we weren't able to get bank statements for and fully underwrite it of what those would look like. And so until we, again, moved the cash flow metrics to the top of the funnel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point that personal credit can work great. There is a time and a place for credit, but it doesn't tell the whole story in all cases. I think it's maybe worth just mentioning as well that business credit has some gaps, right? It's a fragmented ecosystem. And if there's 30 million small businesses out there and much of the population that we see is in that long tail, there's a lack of business credit coverage.
Yeah, and I think the business credit goes even further with problems. And I think, most of the folks, I kind of looked at the distribution of folks that were on this podcast are in the MCA and alternative lending kind of space. And a lot of us have the same challenges, which is you pull the business credit. It's difficult to get enough attributes for some of the size of these businesses to make a credit decision off of it. A lot of times you won't find significance and presence. And so it's getting enough penetration and coverage to make an effective model. If you only can get 50% of your businesses to have a business credit profile, it gets harder to say, well, I'm good if I can get the business credit profile, I can have a good model, but what do I do with the rest? And so you run into this problem of the on the business credit side of just, quite frankly, for the smaller businesses, it's either sparse or doesn't exist at all.
Right, exactly. You have no credit until you have credit, right? Exactly. And so I know you have taken a really fine-tooth comb approach to discerning what should go in your funnel and where and when. And you've come out with a model where you feel like in many cases, cash flow above credit really makes sense for you. But I don't want to speak for you. I'd love to hear how you've decided to structure your funnel and kind of how you got confidence in the funnel that you did create and how you may even think about it based on different channels.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's a great observation. And so for us, we looked at it as a couple of ways, right? And we, like I think a lot of folks do, look at much more of a cost per decline style model, saying, okay, underwriting is expensive. A lot of us face underwriting a lot of leads. And so you can drive up costs a lot through that process. And it's like, okay, how do I make a very cost effective decision early in the process? And some of that is, and again, credit was kind of one of the first traditional ones previously, is to say, hey, I've got a credit model. I can knock out some people that I think are not credit worthy. A couple of things over a number of years have happened. Credit pulls have become more expensive. I think when you start looking at what the bureaus charge and FICO charges, those have rose meaningfully since COVID. Even really going into COVID, there were price increases. And so some of those make that more expensive a decision. So you have that going on. And the second, I think, and far more important, is just for us, it's looking at it, knowing that we were knocking folks out that we didn't see their full business. And so the way that we did it is said, that's the hypothesis, and like a lot of things when you're doing credit and kind of risk analysis, you're saying, okay, what do we do to figure out if this is true or not true? And part of this is, and it was great partnering with you guys, and we could do a retro as an example. So we took the stuff, sent it off and said, all right, these are things that we would not have otherwise let go through the process. What if I had let them go through the process and then we had gotten bank statements? What would that have looked like? And so sending it off to you guys, doing the retro, getting the information back and doing an examination on that of saying, oh, interesting. A lot of these had healthy cash flow structure that didn't make it through our credit rules. Still don't know how they're going to pay, so that gets to be interesting. It would have passed the cash flow model, but because we weren't loaning to them or providing capital to them, we had to go back and say, okay, it looks like it's interesting. We would have definitely done more of these. We can do the cost-effective knockout. So we kind of said that'll work. Now it comes to proofs in the pudding. All right, let's run some tests. And so we had to move it to the top of the funnel, run some loans and or leads through the process to see, we get loans and MCAs. We do both as an example. And so push those out as part of the process. And then check performance. And lo and behold, when you kind of come back and you look through your results, and we've been doing this long enough to have plenty of results. And actually, we've opened up our decline models at the top of the funnel because of it. As you do that, you start looking back and saying, wow, we were right in some instances, some of the credit, but we were wrong in a lot of instances. And obviously, here we are today talking about it. So we did leave it at the top of the funnel. It's still top of the funnel, and we're having good success with those at the top of the funnel. And so now we're just learning on additional swap ins. We continue to use that credit information to pick up the incrementals. So, and another great slide, like I knew it was coming.
Yeah, it's almost like we rehearsed this. Well, I think what you're sort of getting at is it's not, when you're structuring your funnel, it's not just about cost consideration. It's also about incremental declines. And it sounds like in your case, you were both able to decline some deals more quickly and knock them out quickly, but you were also able to do more approvals where credit may have potentially indicated that it wasn't a good risk.
That is, and it both happened. And the examples I think, and these are examples most would be able to find in their underwriting data, is when you get to the cash flow part, all of us tend to have a max number of NSFs or neg days or min balances, min revenue. I mean, there's cash flow hard knockouts, right? Whether it's driven by our capital provider to us or our own credit risk criteria, there's a box, so to speak, right? And so when you hit that, you're already going to have those declines no matter what. So the thing is, if you knew those up front, you automatically have no additional data costs associated with them. So you get the cost save. So you do still get some cost saves out of that structure. But on the flip side of this, to your other point, it's not just about the cost saves. It is far more about not declining things that are good customers or could be good customers early in the process without having a better credit profile, right? And the credit profile, I'm including the cash flow data as part of that. And so for us, it was looking at that cash flow data and really recognizing that having that at the top of the funnel, we were able to keep people in our funnel throughout the process. And in the end, the net approval rate went up pretty meaningfully. And so, it went on a couple of fronts. I still save some cash on costs because I'm knocking folks out earlier than I would have otherwise. And some still hit the credit and get knocked out at credit. But when we do the math on the net, it was for us in the world we see, pretty easy decision to leave it at the top of the funnel.
Love it. So there's cost savings, but there's also revenue generation opportunities. How about thinking about how you should structure your funnel based on the channel from which you receive the lead? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, and I think that's a great call out, because the other thing that you get in here is fraud's an interesting thing too. So I'll throw a couple of things back as answers to that question. And first is, as you think about validating a customer and if they're fraud, the fraudsters have perfect credit. I mean, that's kind of fraud 101, right? If you're going to be a fraudster, you can't use a bad credit profile because you get declined credit, right? So most fraudsters have no questions on their background and their credit stuff. I mean, that stuff's the stuff that's solved. And so as an example, most of our fraud detection wasn't able to really get picked up and hit until much later in the process. And so, with what we've got, one, you can pick that up inside your bank statement. So profiling things, and some of that is where a lead came from. Some of it is, so the acquisition channel. Others of it can be using it for the type of industry a lead is. And so the thing that gets to be interesting about it is, a transportation company, especially over-the-road trucking as an example, has a generally look-like set of expenses and revenue in their account. And you can easily say, yep, that kind of passes. I'm going to use the smell test as an example. That passes the smell test of what, would look like in that. I mean, the models do a much better job than Herk's smell test, but and so then you get that opportunity to say, oh, okay, this one is good. It's worth the additional expense. It's worth the additional investment. And so for us, identifying that with industry became another critical component of allowing this kind of to move forward.
I think that's such an important point as well, that kind of does highlight one of the gaps or opportunities that exist with business credit, is there isn't this sort of granular level of business credit score for like florists versus restaurants versus bicycle repair shops. And in reality, like, and you're the expert, you're saying, I actually know the cash flow profiles of each of those types of different businesses will look different.
Yeah, and I gave the example of fraud, but you're exactly right. I mean, you're referencing kind of using that same stuff in a credit profile risk. And so, you can take, I'll use the example that you gave of a florist, right? And so a florist, if you see enough of anything and you do it, that you can gonna say, this is what a good florist, set of bank statements, set of cash flow structure looks like. This is ones that are higher risk. And so suddenly you can start parsing the risk off of that. And risk extends to fraud risk, but it also uses the same thing for extending into your credit risk lane, which is, anything that you have a high instance of, you can very quickly become a cash flow expert on what that should look like and what the risk variants are going to be on that, right? Just off of looking at their cash flow. And a lot of times, their background information, so their credit background and other background stuff may look vastly different. But what you start to notice is there's a lot more risk grouping around the cash flow metrics than there ever would be around like a credit profile, right? And so if you think of a florist with a 700 FICO score and a florist with a 600 FICO score, you may think, wow, those are going to perform vastly different. But if you look at their bank accounts and transactionally, it looks very similar. Actually, the thing you're going to find true, the cash flow is much better at predicting how they're going to perform than anything to do with their FICO scores.
And in both cases, probably 15 NSFs in a given statement period is a good reason to, kick them out.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, I would argue that all depends on the business. 15 sounds scary sometimes, but the reality is some businesses actually can support that, which is an interesting concept as well. And that's stuff that you can learn that you might have thrown out earlier in the process with that, that I think for us is having that basically become available for most of our leads now is we've got the ability to kind of improve those models. So because we're now pulling it on, I'm going to say near 100% of what comes in, I now have model data available for near 100% to further enhance what does that industry look like. Where if you said, okay, I'm only approving, I'm just going to make up a number, 20% at the end of my funnel, well, then I might have only sent 30% through my cash flow model. And so I'm only profiling 30%, and so it's just, if you're feeling like that is your best data, having it be the most available data for you to make decisions off of and build your models off of, perpetuates the learning, perpetuates the accuracy, perpetuates, either a change in risk to do more approvals or cut out risk based on some of the performance. So.
Yeah, completely agree. And that's a really good distinction there. And so maybe just sort of moving to the last slide. I know we're kind of nearing time, but just to sort of wrap up, Herk, before we take a couple questions, what's your message to folks listening out here who might say, well, gosh, that sounds like a very intensive process to flip my funnel. What are some basic takeaways to help maybe reassure folks it's not as wild a process as they might initially think?
Yeah, I think the first is really looking at how you got it. The way we did it, and I can speak best to that, is looking at our credit, because we have that, kind of the first big model at the top of the funnel, and said, what do we knock out? And then, parsing into that, saying, well, how much of that do we think we should have let through? And again, we haven't provided capital to them, so that you really don't know the outcome until you do it. So that's the unknown piece. You're going to get to the swap ends where you don't have a choice. You're going to need to do the unknown and say, I don't normally give these people this money. I have to provide the capital now. I'm going to see what happens. And so you're going to get to that, which is also a scary step. But as far as the process itself, identify, and it's very simple, identify, where in your knockouts you've knocked people out before you pulled cash flow. And so your first curious question should be, I wonder what their cash flow would have looked like. And for us, that's where, pulling kind of a retro, saying, okay, let's go off and using you guys as a partner example, send that off to Ocrolus and say, give us the cash flow metrics on these. And then we could look at that saying, cash flow metrics alone, how many of these things looked good off of that? And right there is your incremental, and so then you say, well, this is my incremental opportunity that I could lend to, that I'm saying no today. Now you have to ask yourself, what is that performance going to look like? Well, that's going to be the test, but you can start answering your questions now of saying, if that was at the top of my funnel, and it's, pretty simple math for all of us at that point, saying I would have let these come through and I'd want to give them some money. What does that do to my approval rate? Costs become easy to calculate at that point. And then it's just a decision of what that looks like. For us, we did all that work and it's not a ton, and said, well, this is really the assumptions we need to hit for this to be effective. Thankfully we were right in the end and hit the metrics plus some, and continue to expand on that. Actually, the nice thing for us is you just continue to learn. You have it at the top and you get better with the data that's available to you. So we've opened up quite a bit more from where the retro originally started, just because we're learning, right? Every test we're like, wow, that didn't produce as much risk. Let's go to the next, risk cuts.
Yeah, love it. Thank you. It was beautifully articulated and in a really nice place for us to wrap. And I promised I would let through a couple questions because I know folks will want to ask Herc a few things. Rana, what do you have for us?
Yeah, well, first, feel free, anyone who has not submitted a question either through the Q&A chat, the Q&A box or through the chat, or any other means of social media communication, which we've been receiving some things in for. Herc, I'll direct one towards you. You may have touched a little bit on it, just in speaking about the retro, but how often do you see a borrower who would have been denied during a credit check ultimately getting approved with cash flow?
So we for us, and I can speak kind of quote to the actual retro. So when we ran it off of our population, we got about 50% of our early declines. We're able to make it near the back of our funnel, meaning that we're now providing some type of offer on that initial decline cut. And now there's other knockouts that happen. So there's kind of a swap here. So to be fair, I now can see the NSFs that I would have knocked out later in the process. So I'm knocking some of those out up front as an example. But for the credit alone knockouts, we were able to, and quite frankly, we're diving deeper into that. The retro was 50%. But really the opportunity is getting more and more where we can depend a little less on credit, even in the end models, because the cash flow is a better predictor.
Wonderful, thank you. Hopefully that answered that question there. Nike, this one very evidently positioned for you. How widespread is this newfound approach adopted? Or maybe if you can answer from the lens of how many of the customers you interact with or how many accounts that you deal with have adopted this cash flow first approach.
Yeah, thanks, Rana. I'll keep it quick, but I will say that close to half of our top SMB customers are taking a cash flow analytics above credit approach in terms of prioritizing cash flow in their funnel. We have, of course, customers who are visionary like ECG and many others who have looked at the data and shown that they could be leaving money on the table if they're not flipping the order of their funnel. And so I would say that is half of our biggest customers and growing.
Well, thank you so much. I actually don't have anything else coming in at this point, either between the chat or inboxes or the one-to-one Q&A. So I think
One thing I do want to say on that, I think there's very few things in our small business lending world where you can pick up a cost save and a revenue opportunity, right? We tend to look at them exclusively. And so that's as Nike said, others are adopting it. I think that's what you're going to see as the thing that becomes interesting, is that as people see that, it's like, wow, I can kind of pick up both. I can reduce my overall underwriting cost and I can pick up opportunities at the back end of my funnel. So I think it'll be interesting and more people will want to continue to look at it.
Yeah, thank you, Herc. That is a fabulous, fabulous point to end on. It's like you get both, right? It's a really wonderful point, and I think I might get in trouble if I go too far over. But I do want to give you a chance, Herc, if there's anything else that you want to make sure that you say, or anything else you want to make sure we cover before we hop off.
No, I think we did a good job. I appreciate everybody attending, and I think Nike, thanks for hosting us. I look forward to where this stuff goes. I think this is we're in an evolving industry, evolving access to data, the cash flow. I think honestly, for all of us, even if it's at the top of the funnel, we're scratching just the surface of what we can do with it. Every time we kind of have a turn in our data, I'm excited to see what other things we can pull in the decision making process. So for those of us that enjoy that stuff, that's kind of a fun league to be in. So.
Totally. So thank you, Herc. Thank you, ECG, for your time. Thank you for the influence that you have over the roadmap and giving us great ideas. Thanks for the advice that you offer. Thank you personally for the mentorship. And it's just a joy to have you. And folks, I guess you can wait to see Flipping the Funnel, a musical on ice in 2026.
Thanks,
everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your time. Bye-bye.